friends of the ICL blog. Welcome to another video book interview. I'm Gaurav Mukherjee, an assistant editor for the blog, and I'm delighted to be based in New York City. And I'm going to be joined today by Professor Samuel Issacharoff, who is the Bonnie and Richard Rice Professor of Constitutional Law at the New York University Law School. Sam is the author of several books and journal articles, and along with Sam Carlin and Rick Bildes, he pioneered the field of the law of democracy. And I've had the pleasure of being in class with him and Rick when this was being taught. We're here today to talk about Sam's new book, Democracy Unmoored, Populism and the Corruption of Popular Sovereignty. Welcome, Sam, and congrats on the new book. It's a tour de force that offers an explanatory account for the rise of authoritarian populism and what we can do to beat back some of these forces. To start us off, could you tell us a bit about what you thought was missing in the existing literature that you hoped to address with this book? Like your last book was on the role of constitutional courts as consolidators of democracy in emerging democracies. So what made you shift focus, and what do you think was missing from the field and existing debate?
Well, part of the shift was the response to my last book, which was Fragile Democracies. At one of the book presentations on that, Ira Katznelson, the Columbia University political scientist, was a commentator, and he asked the question whether what I called fragile democracies was a condition of new democracies as they emerge from an autocratic past, or whether that was some inherent disease or weakness of democracies that they all carry forward, like a genetic misprint, and that can surface at any time. This is an observation that's not new to Ira Katznelson. If we go back in political theory, Thucydides made this comment about why Athens couldn't resist going into Sicily. Hobbes talked about democracy as the tyranny of the orators. Machiavelli understood that Rome had institutions. So that was an insight. Why did the processes that I look so carefully at in the post-89 democracies seem to be reproducing themselves in the more established democracies, usually in the advanced industrial countries, but including, and if you want, we can talk about it in India as well. What I thought, this book is in large part a response to that question. What is it about democracy that sustains it in a period of growth and then that weakens it when its institutions start to fail? What I thought was missing from the literature was sufficient attention to the institutional dimension of why populism comes to the fore and how it governs, and why the manner in which it governs, this anti-institutionalism, is a threat going forward to the restabilization of democracy. Most of the literature has focused on the sort of, I'll call the fascistic impulses of populism in office, even though it's elected to office. But Mussolini was elected and Hitler was sort of elected. And so that's not enough to distinguish it. But there's always the demagogy, there's always the xenophobia, there's always the invitation to racialism or ethnic strife or religious strife. But this is a book mostly about the institutional dimension of democratic governance and its challenge by populism.
I really enjoyed how you structured your book with little observations and little anecdotes from everything that you've done, in the last few decades. And so, what do you hope to be the central contribution of this book? And who were you writing for? Who's your target audience for this book?
Well, that's a hard one because I found that I could not write a book for the popular trade press because there was too much nuance to the analysis that I feared would get lost. So I wrote it for an academic press, but I wrote it in what I hope is a very approachable form. I think it's for There are a few technical places, but very few. For the most part, I think it's very approachable, very readable, and not particularly dominated by any one national setting, so that you don't have to be an American lawyer or an Indian lawyer or a Polish lawyer or something to be able to appreciate it. The audience is the educated public who's worried about the demise of democracy, and there has been this is a serious issue, and it's an issue that we all live with. For example, let me give you one example: the crisis in Ukraine, the Russian invasion. When I was young in the United States, at a moment like this, all the TV talk shows would have the members of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. That was the American establishment. Those guys had been there for decades. They knew every world leader. Today, nobody knows who's on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. It doesn't matter. It doesn't exist. And so there's a sense among the educated population that things are spinning out of control. And this book is directed toward that population.
And if you could just sum up what you think are the central takeaways from the book, what you think is the central argument.
So the book has three parts. The first part is titled "The World the Populists Found," and it's in the U.S., but also not in. It's a comparative assessment around the world, and it's a world in which the key institutions of democracy have failed. Most centrally, the legislative branch. If we think about the idealized form of democracy, it always starts with the legislature. The American Constitution, Article 1 is the Congress. It's not the president. The Congress was assumed to be where power and decision-making would reside. And around the world, we see that the legislative branch has receded. Governments operate by executive decree. What we also see is that the legislative branches fail in response to the collapse of political parties, which provided the organizational glue for getting things done, for turning aspirations into policy, into programs. And as a result, the populists encountered a world of deep suspicion toward the institute. These are the elites always getting their best. And we see the way in which that's manifest. The economic advantage of democracy through the 20th century is failing. The idea that democracy is a more participatory form of governance is failing as these intermediary organizations like the parties collapse. So that's the first part of the book, is what went wrong in democracies that opened this path up for the populist assault. The second part of the book is, what does it look like when populists are in power? And here they tend to exacerbate institutional decline. They attack electoral institutions, whether it's in Mexico or in Brazil or in India or in the United States. They tend to move against constraints on executive power and toward a form of unilateralism. They tend to operate through one-off deals rather than institutions of governance. And this is where the notion of corruption comes up in the title. I take from the developmental economic literature, and this is one of the areas where I rely on a difficult body of inquiry. The developmental economic literature tries to ask the question, under what circumstances do we see corruption? And it turns out that corruption is inversely related to the level of economic development of the country. The more developed it becomes, the more institutions rather than individuals take hold. This is basically a Max Weber insight carried forward. And you get lower levels of corruption. When I started to do the studies that for the past 20 years that gave rise to many articles and now 2 books, I started to observe that there was a corruption scandal in every country I looked at, where democracies was weakening. And I would dismiss it well, Zuma has fantasies of a big palace and so on and so forth. It wasn't central to my story. Then I sort of had an epiphany. My eyes opened up and I said, wait, it can't be not central if I'm seeing it in every single place. So something's got to be going on with this. And that led to the conclusion from the second part of this book, which is a little bit of a response to my first book. My first book was about the centrality of grounding democracy in constitutionalism and using constitutional courts for as long as they could hold out as a central buttress for democracy. The constitutional courts have failed. And I give the example, you like my anecdotes, but I have to justify my travel somehow. I give an example of going to Poland to address the Polish opposition just before the last presidential election. And Poland, in its transition from a Soviet satellite, one of the central institutions was the Constitutional Court. By the time I got there a few years ago, the Constitutional Court was irrelevant. It had been completely decimated by the Kaczynski Law and Justice Party government. It had no role. It didn't have funds to publish its opinions. It was a court that no longer played a central role in society. Oddly, the Supreme Court of Poland, which is a court of much more limited authority, it can only hear normal appeals from the civil and criminal system. It can't hear constitutional cases, was becoming a major irritant to the government. Why? Because it was an embedded bureaucratic organization. In Europe, generally judges are career track people, so they come in as apprentices when they just graduate law school, and they rise up through the ranks of the judicial bureaucracy. They are difficult to move. They are difficult to dislodge. And it's interesting that both their bureaucratic insulation and their limited mandate on only ordinary law proved to be the undoing of Zuma in South Africa, proved to be a major problem for Bolsonaro in Brazil, and continues in all of these regimes. So this is a book about the importance of ordinary law and holding on to very fundamental rule of law principles. It is not a book about that validates constitutionalism as such. It tends to play a much more limited role in this book. And the third part of the book is basically where to now, what can be done to revitalize democracy. And here I'll just say that the temptation when you write a book like this is always, well, here's my 5-point program and just do these.
Well, you do have a 4-point program. So
I do. But but Gaurav, to be fair, it's not a very good one because it's, I think if there were 4 points that were an easy fix, it'd be like The Economist and the $20 bill on the floor. If it's really there, somebody would have found it already. And I tend to, what I use the concluding sections for about what can be done in these circumstances is not to say, here, I'm smarter than everybody else. Here's what can, but to show how difficult it is. Because if one of the problems is executive unilateralism, then you need more state competence. But if another problem, you need more legislative, more separation of powers. But if another problem is the decline in state competence, then you need to buttress the parts of the government that can get things done, which means give more power to the executive. And these run directly against. And so the last part is that why it's so difficult to engage in the process of institutional repair. It's much easier on the disrepair side.
I really enjoyed how clear you were about the trade-offs, right? That there are no easy fixes, and if you push in one direction, it really tends to, the cart tends to run away in the other. So I really enjoyed that. Something I wanted to ask you about is that two notable things about the book is that it's very broad in the jurisdictions that it covers, and it's extremely topical. So you probably started writing this book a great many years ago. So I'm wondering how you dealt with the challenges of contemporaneity and the idea of breadth versus depth. How do you deal with that?
Well, you raise a question both about methodology and what it means to write a book as opposed to articles when you're dealing with a moving target. On the methodology point, I have been working on this for a number of years. The first piece I wrote that contributed to this was actually for a conference of the American Philosophical Association, the philosophy professors. And I decided to write a piece on the elements of political theory that play into democracy. And one is the right of participation. Another is the sort of equality of citizens, the dignity that it offers, the sense of solidarity. And I started to think about how those can come undone, because I started to write this in the post-2008 period when democracy was clearly under stress, even though we were still, at least in the United States, in the optimism of the Obama period, or at least I was in the optimism of the Obama period. The book was largely conceptualized before the election of Donald Trump. So this is not a book about Donald Trump, although obviously he figures as one of the examples of the phenomenon that I'm concerned about. And given that I am in the United States, and given the centrality of the United States in public thought around the world, it occupies an accordingly large role. So I think about this more broadly. If I can go back in time, just one piece. You mentioned that I worked for many years, and still do, with Rick Kapildis and Pam Carlin. We built this field called Law of Democracy. It was largely an American-focused enterprise. And in 2000, 2001, two things happened that shook me up. One was the attack on the World Trade Center, the September 11th. And the second was the Florida election of 2000. And the one was, how do democracies deal with national security threats, which we haven't had to do very much in this country, at least not since the Civil War period. And the second was, how do democracies deal with contested elections, failed elections, with deep political challenge? And what I realized was that we're not the only democracy, so there's got to be a lot of examples of this around the world. And that's when I started to shift my focus away from the United States and write internationally. And I'm never going to be the expert on South African law or Indian law. But the first time I was ever in New Delhi, in India at all, was to present a paper on Indian election law, and how these electoral cases, which in India were seen as attempts to prohibit proselytizing, and it was seen as part of the religious coordination of a very difficult society. I came in from the outside and I said, hey, wait a second. These are electoral speech cases. These are about preserving the integrity of the political process. And the response from my audience in India when I presented this was, that's kind of interesting that you would look at it that way, because nobody here has ever looked at it that way. And they very much appreciated my audience that I said, we in the United States have a lot to learn from this. And they said, we've never heard an American come to India and say that before. You know, it's always the other way around. Let us tell you how things are done. And I had the same experience in South Africa. There's a certain, like, who are you? Where do you come off? On the other hand, if you can, open the aperture a little bit and step back, you get a different picture, and the comparative picture is harder to do. I'm always subject to the critique of what's your method? How did you pick your case studies? Did you do your double blinds and all this? And I say, no, I'm just telling you what I see, and you can take it or leave it on its own terms. On the question of the moving target, it's really hard. And I was starting the book process when COVID began, and that pushed me back a bit. And I think it's a better book for that, because one of the chapters that will be of some controversy, I suspect, is I say, come on, January 6th, I'm from Argentina. That's not a coup. Let me tell you how you do a coup. The one thing we do very well in Argentina is coup d'etat. This is, my basic view is, if American democracy is going to be overthrown, it's not going to be by some kook wearing a Viking outfit running half naked through the Capitol. That's not the existential threat.
This is a cookout that just went too far. Yeah. So no, you're right. Like I definitely see that. Sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
But so I step back, and by stepping back from the intensity of the moment, and I won't disguise, I was very pleased that Joe Biden won the election, that I'm very pleased that Bolsonaro lost. By stepping back from the intensity of the moment, you can re-equilibrate and get some sense of how this fits into the bigger picture. I hope. I wouldn't like to have come out with this book 5 years ago, sure, but I don't know that I knew enough to write it then.
I think academics around the world will join you when you say that they had wished they'd written a book that came out 5 years ago. So we're always 5 years behind. My final question to you is, what do you think is missing, and what do you think are some of the really big unanswered questions in the field of comparative studies of authoritarianism today? What would you like to see yourself or other scholars? What are the kinds of questions that you think are looming in your mind that have not been tackled yet?
I think the big question is, what will democratic politics look like over the next period of time? We've had what my colleague Rick Pilders calls the fragmentation of political authority. And this is true across the democratic world, with a few exceptions. India is complicated because first there was fragmentation, now there's reconsolidation in ways that I find troubling. But what will political authority look like? Is the future really the BJP? Is it really Modi reconstituting a populist party on more or less openly authoritarian bases? Will it be this kind of endless personality-driven form? Will there be a capacity to get things done? We have a new challenge from Elaine Landemore and people like that, who want to find more plebiscitary mechanisms. There was just a constitutional referendum in Chile on a constitution that would have devolved power into endless kind of small-based plebiscitary looking organizations of the state. So that,
and you have a fascinating piece on that, so with Sergio Verdugo, which I recommend everyone check out. So yeah, this is a small plug for your piece. Yeah.
Thanks. Any plugins would be great. So that's, I think, how democratic politics will be organized going forward is the key question, because we can look back over the last 200 years, which I call the period of democratic ascendancy, and that was basically the consolidation of a certain kind of stronger central government, legislature as policy organ, executive with dynamic administrative powers, and basically a social welfarist consensus with, the Labor and the Tories were always going to disagree about where the boundaries were, but they didn't really disagree on the core elements of it. And now it's all up for grabs. And it's up for grabs because the institutions that kind of held that together have weakened, or in some instances disappeared. Take the last French presidential election. The combined votes of the socialists and Gaullists was under 10%. They were both eliminated in the first round. when I was a kid, that would have been inconceivable. It just could not imagine the Congress Party disappearing from the Indian Congress. Was for you, just an inconceivable event, and now it's a reality. And so I think that's the critical question of our time. It's important, but I think it's a little too easy to write the denunciations of the banality of some of these populist figures who've come forward. But I think the positive vision of how a stable, decent politics can be restabilized, I think that's the critical issue of our time.
Okay. Thank you very much, Sam. This has been an absolute pleasure. We thank you for your time. You've left us with a lot to think about. So thank you, listeners and viewers, for joining us today. And for more of the same, keep up to date with the blog by following us on Twitter or subscribing to our mailing list. And if you recently published a book on constitutional law and would like to be featured in a book interview, contact us at iscl.blogeditor@gmail.com. So please join me in thanking Sam, and we hope you go out and read this book. Thank you, Sam.
Thanks, Gaurav. Always a pleasure.